Hello! I am going to review what I think are the best parts of The Autistic Brain by Temple Grandin. It's not that thick of a book, but it is dense with information and super useful. So first she goes on to talk about brain imaging and that her brain went through this special it's like an MRI, but like with with a lot more focus. So she talks about how her cerebellum is actually much smaller than like a neurotypical brain, and she had a lot of difficulty learning how to ski, learning how to do physical things, which is totally related to the cerebellum, which is balance, proprioception, how we interact with the world around us. And then she also talks about enlarged amygdala, are often seen with people with autism. And the amygdala houses emotional functions. And so an autistic person can feel as if he or she is one quote unquote big exposed nerve. So she lists a lot of scientific data. Some find that autistic brains are over-connected in certain areas of gray matter, and some are under-connected to different parts of the brain where it has more localized focus. They do say that all of the autistic brains are different, but we have to focus that autism is a developmental difference. So it's how the brain develops. Okay, so very exciting. So how does it develop? Why? So she talks about gene variation, genetic variation, and also a side note, she talks about, Temple Grandin mentions how before we thought there was a lot of dark matter in our DNA strand, a lot of uncodable nothing. When I took genetics like 20 years ago, that's what the information was. And it's wrong. She was like, I knew it was wrong. I knew there must be something. And the way that DNA is laid out, there seemed to be a lot of nothing between base pairs with information. But then she's like, imagine it's all coiled up, smushed together inside the cell, and then they found parts of the DNA that coded with the adenine, cytosine, all the different base pairs were right next to this dark matter that would actually code and tell the code what to do. And so super interesting. So they found a connection with CNVs. So CNVs are submicroscopic duplications, deletions, and rearrangements of sections of DNA. These variations, which can vary in length and position on the chromosome, have the potential to disrupt gene function. Okay. Okay, where do these copy numbers come from? Most are inherited. So at some point, an irregularity enters the gene pool and is passed down through generations. I think this is also why we can't say that someone can't be a little bit autistic, like you're either autistic or you're not, because a lot of autistic traits are passed down through families, and it has multiple causes, but it does have a genetic component. Okay, but some are not hereditary. They arise spontaneously, either during fertilization or shortly after. These are called de novo mutations. Okay, so important. Okay, so this 2007 study of 264 families in Science found that 10% of autistic children with non-autistic siblings had de novo copy number variations, but only 1% of controls who had no history of autism showed CNVs. So there is something, like we're getting a little bit of information about genetics. The hope that autism could be traced to one or even a few gene variations became less and less realistic, though. By the time phase 2 of the Autism Genome Project, drawing DNA from 996 elementary school-age children in the US and Canada diagnosed with ASD, their parents, and 1,287 controls came to an end in 2010, the collaborators had identified dozens of copy number variants potentially associated with ASD. By 2012, geneticists had associated ASD with hundreds of copy number variations. So this is why you can also say, if you've met one autistic person, you've only met one autistic person, because the genetic variation is so vast. Further complicating the research was that many of the CNVs seem to be, if not unique, extremely rare. The authors of the 2007 science paper said none of the genomic variants we detected were observed more than twice in our sample, and most were seen but once. So super rare. Autism manifests itself in numerous traits, and those traits are not identical from individual to individual. So, really interesting, really diverse. Okay, so let's go to what these genetics code for and sensory, which often includes sensory issues. Okay, so sensory disorders are not just an autism problem. Studies of non-autistic children have shown that more than half have a sensory symptom, that 1 in 6 have a sensory problem significant enough to affect his or her daily life, and that 1 in 20 should be formally diagnosed with a sensory processing disorder, meaning that the sensory problems are chronic and disruptive. Yet, what do we know about the science of sensory problems? Surprisingly little. So there's been a lot of research done on, as I was talking about earlier, genetics, the cause of autism, brain scans, trying to fix it. But when we look at sensory issues, this gets really interesting. Okay, so she's talked to researchers who say that sensory problems aren't even real. Okay, so not every person who suffers from a sensory disorder responds to stimulus in the same way, and not every person who suffers from a sensory disorder suffers to the same degree. Okay. So, in the little that has been studied about this, she talks about that there is sensory seeking people with autism, sensory over-responsiveness, and sensory under-responsiveness. Also sensory modulation. And that's how it's being studied now. But studies of severe sensory problems rely on the testimony of parents or caregivers. The conclusion of those studies rely on the methodology of researchers. But why should we assume that all of these interpretations reflect in what's happening in the subjects themselves? A person who can't imagine living in a world of sensory overload is very possibly going to underestimate the severity of someone else's sensations and that impact on that autistic person's life, and even misinterpret behavior as a sign of one sensory problem when it might be another. This is incredible. So I'm just going to read this because it's so good. So if researchers want to know what it's like to be one of the many, many people who live in an alternate sensory reality, they're going to have to ask them. Researchers routinely disparage self-reports, saying that they're not open to scientific verification because they're subjective. But that's the point. Objective observations of behaviors can provide important information, but the person suffering from sensory overload is the only one who can tell us what it's really like. Amazing. Okay, so she talks about, she's trying to describe her sensory problems to other high-functioning autistics have been able to describe the impact of their sensory problems on their lives, but what about persons with far more severe, even debilitating sensory issues? So she goes on to say there are a lot of logistic problems with this, but overcoming the problems inherent in self-reporting is important. If the only self-reports about sensory issues that researchers have are from high-functioning adults, then the results are not representative. Sensory problems might be worse at lower levels of functioning. They might even be the cause of lower levels of functioning. This is mind-blowing. This is so good. So a study that quotes only high-functioning autistics would present a widely skewed view of the population. What's more, by adulthood, a person can develop coping mechanisms that disguise the true severity of the sensory problem and might not reflect the reality of the same problem as experienced by a frightened child. So this is what Devin Price talks about, that many people of color and women have been forced to mask their autistic sensory issues, and so they've been living and just coping and figuring it out while not getting the accommodations they need. I mean, and also it's developmental, right? So it's like the brains we had when we were little kids are not the brains we have now because it's developmental. We're growing, we're learning. Incredible. Okay. So she then breaks down that for sensory, instead of saying over or understimulated, we should break it into our senses, our actual senses, and how we can, she talks about using colored paper if you have a visual processing issue, or tinted glasses. One really interesting 2005 study analyzed the data from 40 autistic subjects ranging from age 2 to 49, so big range, who had undergone 2 years of music therapy. All 40 exhibited improvements in language and communication, as well as behavioral, psychosocial, cognitive, musical, and perceptual motor skills. And the parents and caregivers of all 40 reported that the improvements extended beyond music into other areas of the subjects' lives. The implications of this are very interesting, because if we think about the history of autism, pulling autistic kids out of society, putting them in institutions, whereas think about in the past, we would have exposed children in every culture to music and art and allowed them to develop in a different way. So it's like, are we just not giving kids what they used to have? Or are there all of these therapies that we could benefit from as a society? Really interesting. So she lists a lot of self-reports of like people being unable to touch things or hear certain sounds, or basically like sensory overload. Researchers might not trust self-reports, but to my mind, quotations like these are an invaluable resource, not just for the information they contain, but for the larger lesson. If you want to know what symptoms of autism mean, you have to go beyond the behavior of the autistic person and into his or her brain. But wait, isn't the diagnosis of autism based on behaviors? Isn't our whole approach to autism a result of what the experience looks like from the outside, the acting self, rather than the experience of what it feels like on the inside? Yes, which is why Temple Grandin believes that the time has come to rethink the autistic brain. So even the way that we are defining it is not useful. I'm gonna skip ahead to back in 1980, when the DSM-3 first tried to codify the diagnosis of autism. Nobody knew about brain systems. Nobody knew much about DNA sequencing. Now we do. We may not be able to apply those advances in science to the DSM yet, but what we can do, I feel, is to begin to change the way we think about the autistic brain. Instead of talking about a set of symptoms in an attempt to assign a label, we can begin to talk about one particular symptom and attempt to determine its source. We've reached a point in our research we can match symptom and biology. Okay. For the first 30 years or so after Leo Kanner introduced the term autism in 1943, the emphasis on the community was finding a cause, and because psychoanalytical theory dominated the psychiatric thought of the day, the cause was hypothesized to be the behavior of the parents, especially the mother. The diagnosis can and will continue to change, but now we can shift our emphasis once again. Thanks to the advances in neuroscience and genetics, we can begin phase 3 in the history of autism an error that returns to the phase 1 search for the cause, but this time with 3 big differences. 1, the search for the cause involves not the mind, but the brain. Not some phantom refrigerator, Mom, but observable neurological and genetic evidence. 2, because we realize how extraordinarily complex the brain is, we know this search will lead not to a cause, but many causes. 3, we need to be looking for a cause or multiple causes, not of autism, but each symptom along the whole spectrum. Phase 2 thinking says, maybe she can't ski well because she's autistic. Phase 3 thinking says, maybe she can't ski well because she has a smaller than normal cerebellum. Phase 2 thinking says, let's group people together by diagnosis. Phase 3 thinking says, forget about the diagnosis, forget about labels, focus on the symptom. So treating people with autism, autistic people, by actual symptoms, because we already see that it is super diverse, and it's an internal experience caused by very specific brain development that manifests in sensory experiences that are different than neurotypical brains. Temple Grandin kills it. She goes on to talk about the strengths of autistic brains and how divergent thinking can benefit society. There's a lot in here. There's a lot. I mean, as you can imagine. So highly recommended. Let me know what you think. I know this is a very contentious topic, and I go back and forth from saying autistic person and person with autism. I have heard very strongly both ways, so if you prefer a way, let me know. Yeah, and take care.